Imagine standing at your father's grave on the day of his funeral, flowers in your hand, tears on your face, and a complete stranger walks up beside you, looks at the headstone and says, "That's strange. I buried my father in this exact spot 11 years ago." What would you do? What would you say? And more importantly, what would you do when you discovered that both of you were telling the truth? This is the story of Marcus Webb, a man who went to bury his father and instead unearthed a secret his entire family had spent decades trying to keep underground. The funeral of Gerald Webb was held on a Friday morning in September. It was the kind of September morning that tricks you. Bright sunshine, a cool breeze, the trees just beginning to turn gold at the edges. The kind of morning that feels like the world is showing off, like it has no idea that somewhere beneath that blue sky, a family is falling apart. Marcus Webb was 41 years old. He stood at the graveside in a black suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. He had not worn it in 4 years, and stared at the mahogany casket as it was lowered into the ground at Greenfield Memorial Cemetery in Hartford, Connecticut. Around him stood his mother, Diane, his younger sister, Patricia, Patricia's husband, a quiet man named Joel who always seemed faintly uncomfortable at family events. 2 of Gerald's old colleagues from the insurance firm where he had worked for 30 years. A neighbour named Bill Hutchins who had brought a casserole to the house that morning and seemed unsure whether to leave after the food was dropped off. 31 people in total. Marcus had counted them, because counting gave his mind something to do that wasn't grieving. Gerald Webb had been 70 years old. He had died of a heart attack, quietly, in his recliner on a Wednesday evening while watching the baseball game. Diane had been in the kitchen. By the time she came in to ask if he wanted decaf, he was already gone. Quick, painless, the way everyone says they want to go. Marcus had been relieved by that. His father had been a private man, the kind of man who would have hated being diminished by illness, who would have been miserable being fussed over and medicated and helped out of chairs. The quick death felt, in a strange way, like something Gerald had arranged for himself. That was how Marcus thought of his father, a man who arranged things, who planned ahead, who kept everything in its proper order. Standing at the graveside that Friday morning, Marcus had absolutely no idea how wrong that image was. The stranger appeared at the cemetery gate just as the service was ending. Marcus noticed him from a distance at first, a man perhaps in his mid-50s, standing outside the low iron fence that bordered the Webb family plot. He was not dressed for a funeral. He wore jeans and a dark jacket. He had grey at his temples and the look of a man who had driven a long way without planning to stop. Marcus assumed he was visiting another grave nearby. Greenfield Memorial was a large cemetery. People came and went all day. He completed. Until the man pushed open the gate and walked directly toward the Webb family plot, toward Gerald Webb's freshly covered grave. Marcus watched him approach with the mild confusion of someone who assumes there must be a reasonable explanation. The Mark walked up beside Marcus, looked down at the headstone, Gerald Raymond Webb, 1953 to 2023, beloved husband and father, and stood very still for a long moment. Then he said, quietly and without any introduction, "That's not possible." Marcus turned to look at him fully. The man's face was pale. He was staring at the headstone with an expression Marcus could not immediately read, somewhere between confusion and something that looked almost like fear. "Excuse me?" Marcus, the man, to register Marcus for the first time, seemed to realize he had spoken out loud. "I'm sorry," the man said. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Is this your family? This is my father's grave, Marcus said, his academic. The Mac at the headstone. My name is Arthur Crane, he said, and I buried my father in this exact spot 11 years ago. The name on Arthur Crane's father's grave had been Walter Crane. Arthur had the documentation on his phone. He had photographed everything when his father passed in 2012. The bury records, the Semirate 4 order. Plot number 4G, Section 9, Greenfield Memorial Cemetery, Hartford, Connecticut. Marcus pulled out his own paperwork from his jacket pocket. He was an accountant. He carried documents the voice other people carried wallets. His father's burial plot, 4G plot, the same plot. The same plots do with its about reason when their heart stain lang, and stared at itself. Marcus pulled out his Arthur completely looked on in the art. Arthur had concern in these started Crane set his stared at his other. Marcus pulled out his Arthur Rain and stared at each other 140,012, 29. Marcus to quote second in the fact. Marcus pulled out his own paperwork from Section 12, start at 9, in this came. Marcus took a plon in his last way, so far the land which was 4G, Section 9 2 years, the name out for long time, and stared out this contact. Marcus pulled out his own get. Marcus pulled out his own out 2 9. Iperthanova man is stared out. Marcus pulled out his own 4G and stared out 4. Marcus pulled out his own stared out some 3, Antitney discussed it on 4G. Thee is a namal of myself. Marcus pulled out his own in 10. Marcus pulled out his own set 3 out some 3 out, 2 ears. Marcus pulled out his own 18 17 ponce and said out cooled it. Marcus pulled out his own set Thor to 18 17 out, and a ears pot that says ease on said out. Marcus pulled out 2 9 is air ea. Marcus pulled out his own set 3 out and 2 ea. Marcus set 4G and 2 ea. Marcus pulled out.
This has to be a cemetery error, Marcus said. Records get mixed up, plots get reassigned. There's an explanation. I'm sure you're right, Arthur said, but he didn't look sure. Why did you come here today? Marcus asked. Did you know about my father's burial? Arthur hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. I come here every year, he said, on my father's death anniversary, to leave flowers. He held up his hand. Marcus noticed for the first time that he was holding a small bunch of white carnations. It was a reasonable answer, a completely reasonable answer. And yet, Marcus Webb, who had spent 20 years as an accountant, trained to find the number that didn't add up, felt something register at the back of his mind like a quiet alarm. The hesitation. That one fraction of a second hesitation before the answer. Marcus went to the cemetery office the following Monday morning. The records manager was a small, efficient woman named Gloria Stearns, who had worked at Greenfield Memorial for 19 years and had the look of someone who had seen every kind of human grief and learned to process it with calm professionalism. She pulled up plot 4G, section 9 on her computer. Her expression shifted almost immediately. She leaned closer to the screen, clicked several times, pulled up a scanned document, clicked again. Mr. Webb, she said finally, I'm going to need to involve our director in this conversation. What does that mean? Marcus said. It means, Gloria said, still staring at her screen, that this plot has an unusual history that I am not comfortable explaining to you without my director present. The director of Greenfield Memorial was a heavy-set man named Douglas Park, who wore a tie with small golf clubs printed on it and had the deeply uncomfortable energy of someone being asked to deliver bad news he had hoped would never become necessary to deliver. He explained, in measured tones, what the records showed. Plot 4G, Section 9, had originally been purchased in 1987, not by Walter Crane in 2012, not by Gerald Webb in 2023. It had been purchased in 1987 by a woman named Sylvia Webb, Marcus's grandmother. Walter Crane had never been buried in Plot 4G. According to Greenfield Memorial's records, Walter Crane had never been buried at Greenfield Memorial Cemetery at all. There was no record of a Walter Crane in their system, no burial in 2012, no plot purchase, nothing. Arthur Crane had lied. Marcus sat in his car in the cemetery parking lot for 40 minutes. He was not a man who panicked, but he was sitting very still in the way that a person sits still when their brain is processing something too large to move around. Arthur Crane had come to his father's funeral, had known the exact plot number, had lied about why he was there. Marcus took out his phone and searched Arthur Crane, Hartford, Connecticut. There was a small local news piece from 2019. A community award. Arthur Crane, Hartford resident, recognised for 20 years of volunteer work at a local literacy program. The article had a photograph. Marcus stared at the photograph for a very long time. Arthur Crane was 54 years old in the photograph, grey at the temples, strong jaw, dark eyes set slightly close together. He looked, in a way that made Marcus's chest feel tight and strange, unmistakably like Gerald Webb. Not exactly, but in the way that half-siblings sometimes look like each other, sharing a feature here, an angle there, as if built from the same original blueprint but assembled by different hands. Marcus put his phone face down on the passenger seat. Then he drove to his mother's house. Diane Webb was 71 years old. She was a small, composed woman who had cried quietly at the funeral and then come home and made sandwiches for everyone because, as she had always said, the body needs feeding even when the heart doesn't feel like it. Marcus sat at her kitchen table and told her about Arthur Crane. He watched his mother's face while he talked. He was watching for the look of a woman hearing something unexpected. Instead, he saw the look of a woman hearing something she had known was coming for a very long time. Diane Webb set down her teacup. She folded her hands on the table, and she began to talk. Gerald Webb had a son before Marcus, before Diane, before the marriage, before the house on Cartwright Avenue and the 30 years at the insurance firm. In 1968, when Gerald was 15 years old, he had been in a relationship with a girl from his high school named Margaret Crane. Margaret had become pregnant. Both families had panicked. They were 16. They were children themselves. It was a different era with different rules and different fears. Margaret's family had moved away. quietly, quickly. The baby, a boy, had been raised by Margaret and her family under the Crane name, with no formal acknowledgement from Gerald's side. Gerald had been told, at 16, that the baby had been adopted, that it was handled, that he should move forward with his life. He had moved forward, but Gerald had not forgotten, and at some point, Diane believed sometime in the mid-1990s, Gerald had found Arthur. Quietly, without telling Diane. He had located his firstborn son, now a grown man in Hartford, and had watched from a careful distance for years without making contact. Because Gerald Webb had been too afraid to disrupt the careful structure of the life he had built, too afraid to tell Diane, too afraid to tell Marcus and Patricia, too afraid to walk up to a man he had abandoned at birth and say, "I am your father, and I am sorry." So he had done nothing. For decades, he had done nothing. "How do you know all of this?" Marcus asked quietly. Diane reached into the pocket of her cardigan and placed an envelope on the table. "He left me a letter," she said, "to be opened after he was gone." "He planned it," Marcus said, not a question. "He always planned everything," Diane said. Her voice was very tired. Even his own confession. Marcus called Arthur Crane 3 days later. Arthur answered on the second ring. There was a long silence when Marcus said his name. Then Arthur said, "I wondered if you would call." "Did my father ever contact you?" Marcus asked. "He sent me a letter," Arthur said, "6 months ago. He told me who he was. He told me about you and your sister. He asked me to consider meeting you. After he was gone," Marcus said. "Yes. And you came to the cemetery because I needed to see it for myself first," Arthur said. "Before I could decide anything, I needed to stand at the grave of the man who was my father and decide how I felt about it." "And how do you feel about it?" Marcus asked. The silence this time was the longest. "I feel," Arthur said finally, "like I have spent 54 years not knowing why I always felt like something in my life was slightly incomplete. And now I know. And I don't know yet if knowing is better or worse than not knowing." "I think I understand that," Marcus said. They met for the first time, properly, knowingly, on a Saturday in October. A diner halfway between Hartford and Chicago, in a small town in upstate New York. Marcus and Patricia sat on one side of the booth. Arthur Crane sat on the other. They talked for 4 hours. Arthur was quiet, careful, precise, in ways that made Patricia keep glancing at Marcus with wide eyes, because those were the exact words she had always used to describe their father. He had built a life without Gerald Webb, and he had built it well. He was not angry, or if he had been angry, he had processed most of it in the months since Gerald's letter arrived. What he was, mostly, was curious. About Gerald, about Marcus and Patricia, about the family he had existed alongside for 54 years without knowing it. When they finally got up to leave, standing awkward and uncertain in the diner parking lot with the October wind moving through the trees, Patricia did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She hugged Arthur Crane. Not a polite, careful hug. A real one. Arthur stood very still for a moment, like a man who had forgotten how to receive something he had wanted for a very long time. Then he hugged her back. Marcus drove home alone that evening. He thought about his father the whole way, about the man he had believed he knew so completely, orderly, planned, composed, about the letter left in a pocket for after death, the son watched from a distance for decades,
the truth arranged to be revealed only once the arranger was safely beyond the reach of its consequences. He thought about whether he was angry. He found, somewhere around the Indiana border, that he was not. Not because what Gerald had done was right. It wasn't. The abandonment of Arthur, the decades of silence, the cowardice of a confession by letter, none of it was right. But Gerald had been a 16-year-old boy who became a frightened man, who became an old man, who finally, at the very end, could not leave the world without trying to correct the shape of the damage he had caused. It was too little. It was too late. But it was something. And Marcus, driving through the dark toward home, decided that something, however imperfect, however delayed, was worth more than nothing. It had to be.
Moral of the story. The secrets we bury don't disappear. They wait. They wait in attics and cemetery records and letters written to be opened after we are gone. They wait patiently, sometimes for decades, for the moment when the weight of them becomes greater than the fear of the truth. Gerald Webb spent a lifetime being a man who arranged things, and the one thing he could never bring himself to arrange in time was the most important thing of all: an honest conversation. Don't let fear make your decisions for you. Don't let silence become the wall between you and the people who deserve to know the truth. Because the truth has a way of surfacing, with or without your permission. And it is always, always better to be the one who speaks it.